G'day. Welcome to the Financial Bloke Podcast, the podcast for people seeking the wisdom needed to grow their family's wealth and live a happier, healthier and more prosperous life. My name's Ben Law and I am the Financial Bloke. Most farmers and graziers are thinking about buying more land, not selling, but purchasing a new block often requires the sale of some land to fund the new purchase. There are also those that are nearing retirement that'll either be downsizing to a smaller block or selling up entirely and moving into town. Selling any major asset is a complex and stressful process, so the best results are almost always achieved when you prepare really well. The problem is that most of us haven't got years of experience selling properties, so we'll inevitably make some mistakes unless we find the right people to help us navigate the complexities and avoid the traps that the inexperienced fall into. As Benjamin Franklin famously once said, if you fail to plan, you're planning to fail. And with the value of farms these days, the cost of messing up could be significant. And that brings me to our guest today, Ben Forrest. Ben was born and raised on the land in Western Queensland. He's a top rural real estate agent and a partner in the Resolute Property Group. Today, Ben and I are going to be talking about the key things you need to know if you want to be successful when you're selling a farm. So without further delay, welcome, Ben.
Hi, Ben. How are you?
Good. Ben, I want to start with a really quick rundown on your history so we can all get a sense of who you are.
Sure, Ben. I was born in Longreach, probably 1977, going back about 44 years now.
Same model as me.
That's a good news story. Basically, we grew up on a property, 40,000 acres between Longreach and Barcaldine out in Western Queensland. And up to then was probably 5 generations in the bush, and ran a sheep and wool property there with our parents. And Dad basically spent his whole life on that property, and we, since going to school and uni and things like that, left and took up our own careers. But our background has been primarily off the land. And from there, I guess my leap into property, for example, started when I was jackarooing at home, and an opportunity came up at Ray White Longreach, and that's what got me on the property ladder. So it was very much a very interesting path that complemented where I'd come from, and I enjoyed the networking that came from that. And from there, did half a dozen years with Ray White and owned the franchise in that final period, and then moved to Brisbane and did some time with Rabobank in the financial side of lending to agri clients before then going to Colliers and spending more time in real estate. And then now I've come into my own business, and that's where we are today. So 2 years into our own business with another business partner. Yeah. That's great.
And you also sneakily left out there. You did a little bit of time at uni too, didn't you?
Yeah, that's right. We did three good years at Gatton College and agribusiness. It was a really good course actually, and took us overseas, and we interviewed many agribusinesses over there, Mitsui and Mitsubishi, and got a great experience out of that. There's a lot to talk about there amongst all the social stories that came with it. So.
Well, when you go to uni, it's not just the education you get in actual, I suppose you'd say, knowledge. It's also the fun and games to be had in the social experience, isn't it?
That's right. No, it was great time and good time to meet a lot of people, and we still connect today. So
yeah. So where I want to start, Ben, is I think you're in the real estate game, so you're the expert in property, I suppose you'd say. And we're going to be talking today about selling farms. And I think most farmers, it goes without saying, are talking more about buying a farm, not selling. But the fact of life that for a lot of people, they're either upgrading, so they're selling a block to buy a better block, and it might be a smaller to buy a larger, or a B-grade block to buy a A-grade block. Or it could be they're selling a number of blocks to buy another farm or the neighbours. And on the other end of the scale, it's the people that are downsizing or nearing retirement. So they might be taking a large block and going into a hobby farm or a smaller block in town, or it could be all together and moving to the coast maybe and living in a unit for some people. And deciding to sell in some instances, I suppose you'd say, could be a last minute thing. The neighbour's block comes up for sale and you're like, gee, I've got to buy that ASAP, because rural properties don't come up all the time. It's not like living in Brisbane or Sydney where if you want to buy a house, you just go and buy a house. But in the retirement scenario, and if you've got a good quality business plan, a lot of times there's an actual really long lead time. So you've got a lot of time to prepare. And I always think about the Benjamin Franklin quote, which is, if you fail to prepare, you prepare to fail. But in either instance, the goal, I think, in all of this, if you're going to be selling, is to maximize the sale price, make the transaction as quick and easy as possible, and also keep it as low stress as you possibly can, because it's a hugely stressful time. Now, I'm going to open the discussion really widely for us to start. And from your point of view, you've done a lot of transactions. What do you think if someone's thinking about selling a block? What do they need to do if they want to get the best price as quickly as possible and as hassle-free as possible?
Yeah, it's a good question. Ben, I think if you go back a step as well, before even that very stage where they're very engaged in the sale process, and you go back to where they make the decision to sell, there's a lot of reasons why people do sell. And as they talk about it's debt, or it's succession, or it's divorce, all those things that come to mind. There's disruption. People basically, mixed reasons for why people make that decision. And I think with that comes many different emotions as well. So I think it's important that we acknowledge that aspect of it, because that then can sometimes affect exactly how it all plays out and what method of sale and how transparent people want it. And so there is quite a bit in that, and it's important, certainly as an agent from my position, it's important for me to fully understand and be empathetic with that side of it, because I think the strategy does reflect that emotional place that the vendor is in. And not all vendors are families, but we've got to acknowledge the big part of certainly Queensland that I operate in, predominantly families. There are funds and corporates as well that are a little more clinical, but still have their own motivations for selling. So I think once you unpack many of those reasons as to why the sale's there in the first place, then you can start to really talk about preparation and getting the strategy right and making sure communication is right and things like that.
Well, people have got to have the capacity to prepare, don't they? So if someone's passed away or has cancer, for example, which I used to see in my game, was people would get to that retirement age and then someone would die, get cancer, and they'd have to sell. And they may not have capacity to prepare totally for that sale.
Very much so. And not everyone has the luxury of being able to prepare with a perfect plan and a period of time that gives them a lot of comfort. Some people do have to move quickly. So it's a very interesting dynamic part about the rural market particularly, is that not only is the asset often welded to the family, it's as much a personal issue as it is a business issue. And that's what a lot of people in the city sometimes don't understand, is a lot of crossover of currents there. So once you understand the psychology and the emotions of the business decision over the top of that, quite a lot of moving parts you've got to be mindful of, so that you really do make it as comfortable for everyone as possible.
Okay, so that we start with, okay, what's the reason we're doing it? And that can change the way we approach it. Let's just say there's not a emergency or something where there's a high emotion where people can't necessarily do it. How should you prepare, almost like as part of a business plan, to be able to say, okay, well, we've got a plan in 2 or 3 years that we want to upgrade or change? What do you walk onto a place and say, gee, I wish people had done this or should do this?
I often face the situation where people have made the decision to sell and possibly could have maybe presented the place a bit differently in readiness for sale. That's often a common one, but at the same time, we don't get too stressed over the property not being perfect. I mean, the next buyer wants to come along, wants to make it their own as well. So it's important not to overthink that.
It's never going to be perfect, is it?
No. There's just some major strategies you can think about, maybe in terms of the way in which you design the property's presentation for your expected target market. Sometimes if you're a sheep property, but you're looking to target to the cattle market, you've got to be mindful of water systems and things like that can take the sentiment out of the place very quickly if it's not up to scratch. So there's a few examples there where it would have been nice to get them a little bit ahead of the curve, so that those sorts of things could be managed, and an inspection with a cattle buyer, for example, is a lot more of a positive one and translates to the bottom line.
Yep. And I'm guessing, I think we talked about this a couple of years ago, was the house. I mean, obviously not everyone can spend a fortune and hasn't got the time to be able to do it. But I know, when you're buying another place, I would say if my wife and I were going around, she'd have a look at the house, and I'm guessing there should at least be some presentation done to that, so it doesn't look like it's maybe inviting if it's the place you're going to go and live.
Definitely. And I think if you've got a nice house there, I mean, definitely present it as cleanly and as well as you can. Interestingly enough, half the sales these days, people aren't as interested in the house because they're often adding to their existing homes, and therefore the house is more for a manager or for a caretaker or for maybe no one.
So 50%, did you say, Ben?
Very much so. It seems that way. Different every sale you do, but more often than not, people will do an inspection and say, oh, no, we don't need to look at the house, or they'll have a look politely, but it's not really a priority for them. Whereas once there was a time when people were buying the big majority of buyers were first-time property owners and stepping into the game or that, and they were very, very much interested in what their home was going to look like. So, yeah, interesting.
Today's episode is brought to you by AgriCoach. You've worked bloody hard over the years and you've built a solid operation. But as your children grow up and start their own journeys, you're beginning to think about the next 5, 10, and even 15 years and how to keep driving the business forward and ensure a smooth and successful succession plan. Preparing the business, preparing the next generation, and preparing for your eventual retirement all requires a solid plan and a proven process. Unsure about the right steps to take? Head on over to agricoach.com.au/webinar to learn more about our Succession Proof Your Family webinar. AgriCoach, aligning families, growing wealth, and protecting legacies. And now, let's get back to the episode. And I suppose that could be a bit of a waste of money and time, couldn't it? If you've got a block that maybe people are just using as a tack-on block rather than the main homestead, that you could spend a whole lot of time, money, effort and energy renovating it and it not actually be valuable at all.
Well, that's right. And I think the best time to renovate is probably well in advance of that time for your own life and enjoy it as much as you can and try not to, think too much about the next buyer because they can often prove you wrong.
And so what about timeframes? If you said someone came to you and said, okay, well, look, I'm thinking about selling the property. How far in advance do you really need to be planning it if it is part of your business strategy, Ben?
Well, more often than not, we get people when they're pretty close to making a decision to go. So it's not unusual to be a couple of months before the sale itself. In a perfect world, 12 months, 6 to 12 months, and you've got time then to manage some things through and keep everyone's expectations managed on the process and on preparations and vendor due diligence and all those things that do actually take quite a bit of time once you get into designing contracts and all those things. And I find that it's perfect world 12 months and you've got time then to form a relationship properly and just manage those expectations.
Yep. And what about records? I know we talked at one stage about records were really important to have and it helps in the sale. Are good records of the property important?
Definitely. Rainfall records are always sought after. People love to see what's actually fallen on the place. But you've got bomb stations all over the state. So you can get away with going to the nearest bomb station, Bureau of Meteorology station, where they record anywhere up to 100 or 150 years in some cases. In others, there's not as much data. So property records come in handy. I've sold properties where there's been 75 years of very good records and we've analysed them and given good averages and median rainfalls and it's great to work with. And there's others where we've just relied on the bomb 50 k's away and have had to rely on a little bit of data. But people work it out. Buyers are very quick to work it out. I think, they're not fools. I think they quickly can sense what the rainfall for an area is, even though it's variable. It doesn't take long talking to locals and they have to work it out as well. So that's one example. Yeah. Stock records are another aspect. Believe it or not quite sought after. Buyers aren't as hungry for them. Everyone has their own, often in livestock businesses especially, buyers have their own way of running properties. They come in with their own view to run a steer operation or a breeder operation. Traditionally, the other party might have run sheep or some breeders and it's against what they want to come in and do. So typically, books aren't opened up much on stock numbers. And with droughts and good seasons, they are all over the place and they can sometimes be a bit hard to really understand the true trend. But where there's people that do keep good records, no harm done. So there's definitely good records to keep and to present to buyers, yeah.
Yep. And what about infrastructure? Because obviously if you spend a lot of money or time getting your water infrastructure right, your fencing, your pumps, all pumps are up to date, the solar, but like being able to have really good records of what you've spent so that the next buyer comes in and says, wow, I don't need to spend a fortune on the water. Most people want to change things, but it's in good repair. Does that again add to the scenario?
The CapEx itself does add to the value. The records of that CapEx aren't usually as an important request from buyers. In saying that, if you're well organised and you can show them, here's what we spent and what date it was, it's just another confidence factor that leans to the seller's side and gives a good impression on the property. So.
Yeah, this is all about giving people as much information as you possibly can give to make them feel more comfortable to come in and buy the place, so there's no second guessing. I mean, the stocking rates is the one I always see is the interesting one because it can be easily fudged. And I think most people these days go in with a very healthy amount of skepticism because they think, geez, you could say whatever you want about the stocking rates and we've just got to accept it. So therefore they make their own, I suppose to say, assessment.
It's a difficult one to get perfect and everyone would love to get it to a number that everyone agrees on, but no one does agree on a number. And then the seller naturally wants to put a number in that reflects when there's a full body of grass and it's a reasonable season. And we know they're not around every day of the week. they come and go. There's the argument, we'll get a third party in and assess carrying capacity and things like that. And then the subjective even on that level as well, depending on who assesses. So it's a very difficult one. It's a rubbery one. I think it's important for buyers to understand that it's their due diligence. They need to really be responsible for determining that one. As an agent, I certainly love to try and get the number as close to right as possible so that a buyer will go, you know what, that's actually, that seems about right. I really believe that. But there's plenty of times when we don't have that luxury and a vendor insists that, this is the number and we obviously present it on that basis as well. So I think as long as people are open-minded and do their own homework, it's something not to overanalyze too much on the basis that they do their own DD on that, their own due diligence. But you're right. I mean, you're perfectly right. The carrying capacity is a headline number and it drives value. It's one of the direct drivers of value for the sale price or the purchase price. So it's tricky. It's tricky to not be tempted to put a number in that reflects a good season versus one that reflects a bad season, because people will straight away run the back of the envelope number and go, okay, well, there's $10,000 a beast area multiplied by that many cattle. Yeah, that's what it's worth. But ultimately, I think buyers are more sophisticated than that and do their own homework. And
they will. But again, if you're trying to maximize your price, you're trying to make a quick sale, if you can give honest, data-backed up information, as you said, it gives the buyer more confidence to be able to go, gee, this bloke seems to be really, or this lady seems to be really above board and clear. I can not be digging to try and find reasons that this could be wrong. And carrying capacity can be so, without belaboring it, we'll get off it in a minute. But again, it can be so variable between properties that, your property might have a higher carrying capacity than the one just across the valley. And, if you can prove that, you may be able to generate a quicker sale or a better price.
That's right. Look, more information is definitely better than less. There's no doubt about that. If you can present very good information and good factual information, I think buyers are going to have a lot better relationship with the process and the transaction. So that's what we encourage. But it's, it's sometimes at the mercy of a lack of data too and a lack of records.
It just is what it is, because you may not have 20 years worth of data, but if you've got it, get it and present it up.
Especially where some people have bought a property recently and they've just gone and resold it. They may not have records like an owner that has been there for 100 years. So.
Okay. Now, this is the one that's going to be rather amusing for me to ask you. What about picking an agent? I mean, obviously, what should people be looking for? And I'll just give a little bit of background on that. Is people ask me, how do you find a good accountant? How do you find a good financial advisor? And I said, it's really hard. You've got to have good bedside manner. Like, they've got to be able to communicate. They've technically got to know what they're doing. And, you've got to be able to work with them. And you can't necessarily always tell those skills or traits from straight up. And traditionally, it's always been, that Ben Law guy, he's a good bloke, we'll go use him, or that lady's a great person, honest and trustworthy, we'll use them, but they may not technically be the best person to do the job. So if people are looking for an agent, what are the traits that they need to find in them, would you suggest, or the most valuable traits for them to get the best outcome?
Well, I like to say make sure they're from Longreach, they're 5'7", they went to Auckland State School for primary. I think if they can get those three,
1977 model.
That's right. Look, at the end of the day, the main thing is that people feel comfortable with who they're dealing with on a relationship level. I think that's a big one. Vendors aren't fools. They get a feel for people. I think that's the big intuitive aspect of it. At the risk of repeating cliches, I think they need to have a good, honest relationship where there's good communication and an attention to detail, so that little things go towards contributing to a result. It's not a complicated science, as you alluded to. I think people need to have a good manner about them and be a good communicator, because ultimately they need to be able to negotiate at the other end, and that's probably where the money's really made. You can be friends and you can be warm and fuzzy, but you get to a negotiating situation at the end. And if you haven't got some conviction to ask for more money or get that final price, it doesn't matter how good your commission rate is. I think ultimately you do need to negotiate hard at the end. That's the main thing.
Yeah. I heard someone say once, you'll quite often find agents that are good marketers and agents that are good closers or negotiators. And I think that's really important to have those skills, because you want to be able to bring buyers in, but you've also then got to be able to negotiate really well on the buyer's behalf. And that takes a skill to do that and keep reputation in place. And overall, obviously it's honesty and integrity. That's what you want to be seeing in those people. One of the things I want to mention is, from my point of view, is the over-promise to get the job. So what I've found, and this is not in the rural, this is in all real estate or any sales, is over-promising, saying we can get you more money than everyone else. Because I think that's fraught with danger. I've seen it happen in the city plenty of times, where people choose an agent based on they said they can get me a higher price, and they can't. When it's the hammer comes down or the ink dries on the contract, they couldn't. Do you find that is a real problem? Because I think years ago that was a strategy. That was an actual trained strategy. Was, hey, promise high, get the deal in, and then you can work on the price from there. But it's not as much these days.
No. And the Form 60 appointment agency agreements came in and started to try and manage that, so that they actually said, well, have you given a price to get this listing? And if so, prove it, show what other sales there are. And I think that was a way of trying to mitigate over-promising on price. Look, it still happens today. I see it happen. It's fraught with danger. It's just another example of not managing expectations honestly. And you're dead right. I mean, it's why over-promise, and some people do it.
Yeah, and fact-checked. I think you've got to actually background check people. A good referral is always the right way to go. Someone else that's used someone or they've been in the industry for a long time and have a good track record and experience, I think is really important as well.
Well, that's right. And I think also there's always the topic around commission price. It's the old adage, don't always go for the cheapest. I mean, it doesn't mean that they're not the best deal, but often can mean, I always say, if the listing with the vendor is an opportunity to show your negotiating style. And I think it's important that you back yourself as much as you'll eventually back the vendor. So if you're cutting corners and cutting costs very quickly as an agent to a vendor, I guess there is a risk that you could be perceived to be doing that at the other end when it comes time to dealing with the buyer to get a result at all cost. So there is an element of that. But once again, vendors aren't fools either. They will have a sense for an agent that I believe probably makes them feel good, and also without over promising. So there's a bit of intuition required on that one.
I think so. Yeah. Should you tell your neighbours? That's a question that I've always had that I was really wanting to ask you. Is obviously a lot of people keep it really quiet. It's confidential. The rural industry is very confidential. Don't want to know what's going on in my life. Is that something to drum up, I suppose you'd say, interest, let your neighbours know, spread it far and wide, or should you keep things quiet? What's your thoughts around that, Ben?
I think you should definitely communicate well with your neighbours. I mean, they've always generally been a big part of your life. So I think get to them early, but I don't think get them too early, because you need to get ready yourself first. And I think as soon as you tell anyone, regardless of whether it's a trusted neighbour or a friend, I think you got to expect that could get out.
Oh, it'll get,
and then it just can.
Yeah.
Yeah, can just complicate the process if people are knocking on your door when you're not ready to actually pull the trigger and go to market. So that's the only reason I'd say don't rush to talk to people, even if they're close and you trust them. I mean, you've just got to give yourself that bit of breathing space as a seller, and then you can do things a little bit more on your terms in terms of your timeline and the terms themselves. So.
Now, there's a couple of things, I'm assuming you'll be all over this too, Ben, but there's a couple of things as an ex-financial advisor I wanted to mention I think is really important. Is the first thing is you want to speak to your accountant. I think that goes without saying before you sign a contract or before you decide to sell, your financial advisor, your lawyer, and possibly even your bank manager. I think they're key things you need to prepare in advance. And for the accountant, there's a number of reasons, but the main one's tax. I can give you a horrible example. I spoke to an accountant a couple of years ago where one of their clients sold a block of land to one of the neighbours. They filled the contract out. They settled on it, told the accountant at tax time, and because they ticked the wrong box on a form, they ended up with a $400,000 tax bill, all because they ticked the wrong box. So that's probably an extreme example, but it's still important. The second one is capital gains tax. I mean, capital gains tax is essentially where if you buy, say, something worth $1 million and then you sell it for $2 million, you've got $1 million gain. You've got to pay or be assessed to pay tax on that $1 million that you've made when you sell an asset. And there's so many exemptions out there, especially for farmers and graziers as they get older. They can do rollovers, they can do retirement exemptions, but there's some key dates and times that you really need to be knowing. One of those is a 15-year rule. And so you can imagine someone's owned a farm for 14 years, sells it after 14 years, and then finds out if they'd have kept it for another 6 months or 12 months, they could have halved their tax bills. So I think those things are really, really important, is getting in front of your accountant about that. From a financial advisor's point of view, well, for people that are retiring, it's the money that you get from these properties are probably going to be funding your retirement for the rest of your life. So you need to be talking to, it might be your accountant about the tax, but it could be a financial advisor about what are you going to do with that money when you get it, or where are you going to put it to be able to generate. And with superannuation and a few other structures, there's some really tax effective ways of investing your money once you're retired that you want to make sure that you do your timing right. And from a legal point of view, I look at it, I think you alluded to it before there, Ben, was You want to know if there's going to be any legal problems in the transaction before you sign a contract with someone, because you want to, basically bring it up front rather than get a contract signed. All the other buyers have gone away. You're just about ready to settle. And then the buyer's lawyer comes back and says, oh, there's a problem here with an easement, or there's a problem here with a mining lease, and the whole deal falls over. Have you seen a bit of that over time, Ben, with the not getting things done up front, leaving it until the afterwards?
Definitely. You've nailed all of those areas. I mean, I think it's important for people this is one of the biggest transactions of their life most of the time. So this is the time to make sure you really select your accountant and your lawyer and your financial advisor very wisely. It doesn't mean you've got to stick necessarily to your existing. I'm not trying to break up any relationship. It's just some accountants don't have a lot of experience in an agribusiness transaction and just don't do them very often, especially large ones. And it's important to select the right one. It could save you millions. I mean, it's one of those, don't cut corners, don't cut costs, don't go for the cheapest, just get the best you can and get a referral from someone and find out who's just recently maybe done a big transaction and get their experience and understand all the moving parts. I mean, we really encourage people to get a contract done well in advance and use a lawyer that really does specialize in agribusiness transactions, especially if it's a more complex asset. Some assets are simpler than others, and it's part of the course, depending on that. But totally agree with you. I think you covered it well. I see a lot of transactions where they did pay huge amounts in tax where they didn't have to. And we've done transactions where we've done legal advice has shown it's best to sign an option agreement to get us through to July and then sign the contract then, so that, like you said, gets us into the next period, saves a lot of capital gains, all that sort of thing. So it's perfect. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really important point. So I'll touch on that, and this isn't advice as always, but one of the big things that the mistake people make is if you're selling an asset, we talked about that capital gains tax, and people think, quite often mistakenly think, well, when I settle on that property, when I get the money in the bank or we hand over the deeds, that's when the property's sold. But it's actually when the contract's signed.
Exactly.
So a simple example is you sign a contract, let's say on the 30th of June, or say the 29th of June to make it cleaner, the 29th of June, but you settle on the 1st of July, it's actually considered that you've sold the property on the 29th of June. So it falls into the previous financial year. So if you've got some of those, like I talked about, the 15-year exemption, or you've got some retirement exemptions, and I've seen that mistake happen more often than not, because practically the average person would say, well, when I get the money is when I've sold the damn thing, not when I signed the contract. And again, you got to get that right. And that is one I've seen so many times.
So have we. It's a big one.
Yeah, and I think if you're selling an asset worth $200,000 or $300,000, I mean, yes, it would be an impact. But if you sell something worth $1 million or $20 million, the numbers of the tax and the implications are significant, and they'll far outweigh the costs of good legal or tax advice.
Yeah, no, that's well said.
Banks also too. Another thing is making sure you talk to your bank about it, because obviously if you sell a property, it's security. Will it impact your serviceability? Will it trigger a full review of your situation? I think it's a good idea to talk to your bank manager. Obviously you might need some confidentiality at some stage, but it's always a good thing to talk to them as well. Now, mate, I think the next part I want to go into, which is where you'll probably shine, is what is the best sort of way to sell your property, or what are the options? I mean, you've got auctions, offers, etc. Can you just run us through what are the different ways of selling the property? And I suppose you'd say the pros and cons of each, or where the market would be preferable for that sort of selling. So let's start with what are their ways, and then we'll go from there.
Sure. Private treaty is obviously where the vendor and purchaser deal with each other privately. They may disclose a price, they may not, but either way, there's no timeline on it. There's tender, there's expressions of interest, and there's auction. And tender is a more formal way of inviting offers for a sale, where the contract is drawn up. There's a letter of rules of engagement, and people just put their offer on that, and generally gets submitted, and that's it. And they pick the highest price and go with that. Expressions of interest has come about more recently as the landscape in transactions has changed, and there's more funds and corporates and that involved. Don't love going to auction, for example. That's not their preference. They like to do their DD and do it under contract terms, and that's why you get expressions of interest on more complex assets where a lot of work is done up front, and basically then you've got auction, and that's, as people know, it's a timeline of about 4 to 5 weeks on the market, And at the end, it's auctioned on cash terms and fixed deposit, and everyone commits to those terms together.
So the first one is just basically a normal sale, which is you put a property up for sale, you put a price on it. I want $5 million for this place, and then people negotiate and you come up with a deal. Number two was the tender, which is everyone puts their best offer in
on a contract
with their
formally.
terms. So terms is.
Yep.
Yeah, and its terms is like, well, subject to finance, subject to the sale of a property, the price, how long the settlement will be, etc. And then the seller gets to sit down and go, okay, well, I've got 10, I suppose you'd say, contracts or offers here. I'll choose the one I want. And then the next one was the expressions of interest, which you mentioned that corporates seem to like a lot, which is essentially where people put in an offer. Do they sign a contract then?
Not often,
Ben, or is that just basically saying this is our number and then we'd like to go into discussions and do due diligence or check it out?
That's right. By definition, it's really expressing an interest in whichever way people like to do. Some expressions of interest campaigns can be encouraged onto a contract if buyers want to position themselves more favourably, but someone could send an email. It just depends on how the agent conditions that process. So it's a less formal method.
Yep. And then the last one is the auction, which is we all know about, which is the property's put on the market. That's not subject to finance or any other conditions. You have to get everything prepared in advance if you're going to buy it. And once the hammer falls, you've got it. You have to settle.
That's right. To start with auction, there are many reasons why people do like going to auction. It's on the vendor's terms. It's a cash offer. When the contract and the hammer falls, it's a cash unconditional offer, and they know they've got a deal in 30 days or 45 or 60 days, whenever the settlement time frame is. It is a more transparent process. People come together and bid. There are online auctions which are less transparent in terms of people seeing each other in the room, but are equally, if not more transparent in terms of where the bid came from and the registration of that bidder and that side of it. So auction traditionally has been a fairly safe way of showing the public what the market is and all buyers coming together and competing for it and making that market. It doesn't mean to say that it's always the best method for getting the best price. Sometimes you can do it in a private treaty or in expressions of interest. It just comes down to how it falls on the day, really. And there is some luck involved in all of those methods and just who turns up on the day. So, but private treaty, if I go back to that, private treaty is for some people just quickly want to list a price. The neighbour might jump over and say, okay, let's do it. And they do a quick deal, and that has its place. Sometimes where the disadvantages are of a private treaty is, are there any buyers out there that were stronger? Could you have put some competition together at the end? Is this the best money? So you've just got to be happy with the result and move on. Tender is a good way to still try and get a sound offer on paper, but they can change the terms. They can put their own subject twos in if they really want to, unless they're specifically instructed not to. But it doesn't capture much emotion in the bidding process. There's one bid that's often made in a cold environment, in private. It's sent into the solicitor. The solicitor opens it 24 hours later, and it doesn't really give the opportunity for buyers to really compete for it at the other end. So there's an element of perceived disadvantage that there's not the premium that comes from an auction, which is more an emotional bidding environment. Expressions of interest, it's copped a lot of criticism over time because people are in the dark. They don't know what their offers are, how they're being handled. They hear that someone's higher than them. They don't know what to do after that. They're given the opportunity maybe to come again. It's an unnerving way to extract an offer from buyers. It needs to be handled very carefully so buyers trust you and that you're not using anyone's information to disadvantage or advantage someone else. It can be done well if it's handled very delicately, but a lot of participants in the market don't love it because it's not transparent enough. But then again, some buyers won't buy unless it is on those terms because they need time to do their own DD and they want an environment that's not public like an auction. There is a place for it. I mean, there always will be. And you see agents out, we're all marketing that way every now and then. And an auction, I prefer auction myself. It allows you to market widely. It allows you to bring in the whole market and let the market sort itself out on the day. And I think it's transparent enough to satisfy everyone. Everyone criticises every method. I haven't found a buyer yet that likes any method. And some say, I hate auctions. And then some say, I hate EOIs. And then they say, can't you just tell us what price you want? And all these sorts of things. So as an agent, I can never keep everyone happy, even if you try to do everything they want. There'll always be someone saying, I don't like this method of sale. But at the end of the day, it's important, really more for the vendor, it's their sale, so they really need to have the final say on how they'd like to sell it. It's our job to give them the pros and cons of each and then leave it up to them to decide. And if there's a risk that they've left money on the table because they haven't brought in the rest of the market, that's their call. That's up to them to decide if they want to take an offer up prior or if they want to go private treaty and not see what the rest of the market might have in its pockets. It's the vendor's decision. I don't think it should be a high pressure environment, and leave it up to the vendor to work it out.
The pros and cons I sort of see for a lot of them is the fact that you could exclude certain people in the process. So, for example, like you mentioned before, expressions of interest, you might get a whole lot of people that go, we're just not interested in putting an expression of interest till we know what it's worth, or we can go to an auction where we can see. We're just not comfortable. And because most people that are buying properties, they're not buying properties every week and have a good experience in it. It might be once in a lifetime or a couple of times in a lifetime. So they don't feel confident about it. And the same as with auctions. I mean, some people just don't want to go into a public forum and be seen to be bidding and the emotional side. So I can absolutely see the pros and cons. If I can just give one example, which was something I learnt and I was really surprised about, was I had a client of mine a couple of years ago, and they actually sold via tender. And I remember having the chat with them about it and saying, that is absolutely bizarre. I don't understand why you'd go that process. And they were very smart operators. And they said, we want control over who's going to buy this property. And I said, what do you mean by that? He said, well, the market's hot. We want to choose. They didn't actually choose the highest priced property. They chose the family that bought it. So they looked at all the bidders out there, and then they had the ability to then choose the one they wanted. And if the family that they wanted to take over their family farm when they retired was not too far off the market price, they were happy to let it go. And that's what they did. And it was actually great for them because they felt the highest bidder was someone that they didn't feel would treat the property like they had. Their grandfather had cleared the country up in central Queensland, and then father, and then they had. And so they had a real strong tie to this place and wanted the right person to take over. But they didn't want to have the whole public auction or the negotiating with multiple parties. They just wanted to be able to do it discreetly and quietly behind doors, and it worked beautifully for them.
Exactly right. And it gets back to my point that it really comes down to the vendor's decision as to which way they want to go with it. And there's a lot of reasons as to why they choose a certain method sometimes. It's important though that if we do our jobs properly as agents, we need to just spell out all the pros and cons of each so that they know what they're getting themselves into. And more often than not, people will say, well, I don't want to take money off that guy, or I don't want him to be my owner. But when it comes time, they then think, well, I've actually got a retirement, I've got a fund here. I've got, there's a lot of things we've got to do with, and we've got to finance that somehow. So we've really got to not think about who's necessarily coming on next and start thinking about our next stage. And then you'll find there's a shift in a lot of vendors feeling that, well, look, it's not really about the buyer after all. It's actually more about, let's try and get the best result we can, and okay, let's use those tools to extract full value out of this property. So it's a journey, that one, and I think that's why I think everyone's got to communicate well and make sure that it's all out on the table so that we can go, okay, why don't we just sell it this way? That's the best for your situation. And you get some people go, well, auction, let's auction. You've got to do auction, for this, and this. But that's not true. And it might be the agent's opinion of getting the best result. But as you said, there's other reasons why you wouldn't auction in some family situations. And there's plenty of reasons why you would. So it's a moving target, and it's case by case.
And I think that's an important point you made about that people's values will change as time goes on. When they're thinking about selling it, they want to transition it to someone. But when it gets to, like you said, the rubber hits the road and they see that check coming in, they start thinking about their kids and grandkids and go, well, if I sell this property for X amount less, they get to keep that money, not my grandkids or kids or ourselves. So yeah, I do agree with that. I've seen that happen many times before. Is the value changes at that stage?
That sure does, and rightly so. I mean, it's an evolving journey, the sale journey. It's a lot of emotions, and it's important to manage them as best as possible, and understand that it's a little bit of a roller coaster, regardless of how smooth the process is, and it's just human nature. It's that business and that home that some people are parting with, and I've full sympathy for it. I mean, I helped my parents sell their property after being in the family for 97 years, and it was only a few years ago. And I was very mindful that it was probably the preference of my family to just quietly put a price on it and just quietly try and take a result and not even go public in any way at all. And I respected that. Ultimately, though, I felt that there was a system that might have brought more money to the table, and I felt that auction still had its place. But I was mindful that on the day of the auction, it's pretty high pressure for some people, and we thought, well, let's address this and maybe let's consider an online auction that takes that pressure out of it, but still has the advantages of the competition and people's bidding competitiveness. And in the end, we went down that path. So we found a solution that worked for what I felt were their priorities, and it worked out well. I think that every conversation with every family needs to be like that. It needs to be very empathetic, and I've been on both sides of the fence, and I've been on my property when agents have come, and I've also obviously been on this side, and I just think it's important to take a step back as an agent and just be a little bit mindful of what the vendors are going through, but just run as strong a process as you can so that you try and unlock full value.
And I think it's important to acknowledge and people to think about the fact that if you're upgrading a property, or I've sold this farm to buy the next one, it's an exciting time. You just want it to happen, and you want it to happen quickly. And so you might make a different choice than if you're actually downgrading or, say, selling and retiring or something like that, which has a lot of emotion. So it can be,
That's right.
Can be completely different. I suppose what I saw in the financial advice game was I used to deal with a lot of people when they were either just coming up to retirement or had retired. And I think they underestimated the emotion attached to the whole process. They get to the point where they say, okay, I've got to sell. I know that, and I'm happy about it. But when it comes to the time, stress levels just go absolutely through the roof. And once you've got a strong emotion and high pressure, people sometimes can't necessarily make great choices or act in the best, or with a business head. They act emotionally. And so some types of sale process may not be best for them because of that, taking that into account.
Exactly. And that also, that emotional roller coaster, that often unearths the real reason for selling sometimes that people may not have discovered at the beginning. And you learn as you go along just how many different emotions there are in amongst all the stakeholders or all the owners, or it's not just the direct owners that are on the title. It's everyone that's growing up on the property, or it's everyone that's not on the property but are still part of the family that are influences on the decisions. And it's often a reasonably decent sized group of people that need to be all managed and talked to and understood. And the agribusiness sector is a dynamic market, and it's why I love it. I think there's just so many moving parts, and it's just important to be that a little bit empathetic.
So what are three things, if someone's thinking about selling or they're coming up to selling, what are 3 points you'd like to hammer home that people really need to think about or take away or research, shall I say? 3 things, if you could give us.
Well, the first one that comes to mind is really make an effort to communicate and be aligned with all the stakeholders. Just make sure you're all aligned with the decision, because...
Sorry, Ben, when you say stakeholders, who do you mean there?
Well, that's a good question. Stakeholders, I mean owners and immediate inner circle that really are there also, even though they're not on the title. So stakeholders that might be beneficiaries of the sale, and those that are at least looking out for their family but have a big influence on the decision also. I just think it's important that ultimately it comes down to who's on the title. They make the final decision. So they call the shots at the very end. However, I just think it's important that they're proactive in their communication, so they are aligned up front and early, and it saves any major speed bumps down the track, especially as you get closer to the more pressure end of the deal. That's one obvious one that comes to mind. I think in terms of the mechanics of the sale process, I always encourage people, get a contract early, but just do it regardless of when you're going to sell. I think it's never too early to get the contract ready and have it even sitting in the bottom drawer, because it's amazing how it unearths a lot of different facts and features about the property that maybe even a lot of vendors weren't aware of. And that can sometimes need time to rectify things or to understand easements, or maybe that water wasn't really a pipeline that was granted to you, and suddenly you don't actually have that water legally. So you really need time to then get third-party agreements in order. And I think if they do their DD really early...
And DD's due diligence.
Due diligence for the vendor side. So buyers will do their version, but vendors do their own version to get it ready for the market. And I see it time and time again where we get down the end of a sale process and suddenly you have a contract that's not even finished, or the buyer's asking for one so they can make an offer, and a week passes, 2 weeks pass, and we've got a contract coming out on the night before the auction, and everyone's a bit rushed and no one's really ready to digest what they're really buying. So it happens more often than you would expect. Get that contract ready and always have it ready so that you know exactly what it is you're selling and all those details that go with it. The third one, I think, just keep your agent close and keep talking to them and keep an eye on the market and be ready for what the market really is presenting, because I think there's a lot of sales always going on in a relevant area around you, and it's important just to keep expectations realistic and just keep in touch on that. I don't think you want to overanalyze the market either. Don't just constantly be worried about, whether this event overseas or this commodity price or that's really going to change your property price. I think ultimately it'll be what it'll be, much of that macro stuff. But it's important, I think, just to keep an eye on and be realistic and don't. Everyone does obviously fall in love with their own property, and rightly so. But it's important not to be way out ahead of the market when it comes time to understanding value, because that's where an agent probably does need to sometimes have a sobering conversation about where the market really is, and give honest feedback and just say, look, this is where they're thinking. It may not be quite where you're at, but that's just the honest feedback at this stage. Let's see what the day brings. If you're in an auction environment, it's unpredictable. You don't know until the day. I think it's important. Probably just stay a bit grounded and don't overthink the market too much. And the best time to sell is really when you're ready. It's not when everything's lined up and when everything's perfect in the outside world. I think it's more about your own self and when you're ready to go.
I think there's some really good points in there. I didn't think about all the family involved, or as you put it, the stakeholders. Because if you've got someone who's in your circle of influence, it could be a child or a trusted mentor or something that's not on the same page as you. They're not going to be there to support your decision and help you make good decisions. If they come back and say, oh, look, I told you shouldn't have done it this way, you want to make sure everyone's on the same page and it's a collective decision. I get the point you made about the person that owns it makes the decision, but it's a lot easier to have everyone on the same page or understanding your reason. And the other one there that was really important, I thought, was the planning. It's much easier to sell the property or it's easier to buy the property when you're prepared and on your terms than being forced into it. And I think that's what we see with the more retirement space, is that people get to a point where there's a trigger like a health event or something like that all of a sudden everything just has to be sold. And you're never going to maximize value or make it an easy transaction when that's happening. You'd rather be doing it on your terms and selling when everyone's buying, not the other way around.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, fantastic. Well, that's good. I think there's some really hefty stuff. For me, I think my advice for anyone that's looking at doing it is speak to your lawyer, speak to your accountant. Absolutely. That contract part you mentioned, I think, is critical. Get it done. Do your due diligence, your DD, and same with your accountant. I can't stress that enough. That's where I've seen so many people come undone, and you just don't want to give away that tax if you can actually help it. I think that's true. That's the two things from me I think people need to really think about. And the last point is, you mentioned it earlier, but if you're getting to the point of having to sell and you need specialist tax or legal advice, find someone that knows their stuff. It might not be your person that's been doing your tax or your person that's doing your legal work in the past. You might have to go get some specialist advice and go and pay for it. It'll be far cheaper to pay for that quality advice and get it right than get it wrong.
Definitely, and we see it all the time. We've been involved in a lot of transactions, and with that, we get a good feel for very good quality advice versus very bad quality advice, and it's a lot of money. It's a lot of money. So don't take shortcuts on trying to get a cheapie. It's like all your advisors. Just be prepared. This is the biggest transaction you'll make, most likely. Not always, but most likely. And this is not the time to be a cost cutter. This is the time to invest in those things and not view them as a cost.
Find the right people. Excellent. Okay, Ben, what's your definition of true wealth?
It's changed over time. I mean, initially it was a financial definition. It was based on how much money you might have or how much passive income and how long you could go without being forced to work, those sorts of measures. But I think it goes a little bit higher than that. I think there's more of a spiritual element to it, where it's more about, true wealth is more about the feelings of peace and joy and happiness that I don't think the material world guarantees. It takes a long time to learn that. We start off as kids wanting everything, from a cool car to a private jet, all these sort of things that the world gets caught up in. And I just think you can see a lot of evidence of people with lots of wealth that don't have true wealth, and they're unhappy at the other end as a billionaire. So it proves that these things are intangible, and whilst I certainly no master at it, but it's something to aim for. And, the intangible things actually aren't derived from the material world, and it's just something to think about.
I think that's awesome. Two things, Ben, that I've found along those lines is I've known a number of people that have got close to passing away at that age, a fairly advanced age. And there's two things that became really clear in what they regretted in life. The first one is they all generally say, I wish I'd taken more risk. All the things I worried about, I just worried about doing. I wish I'd had a go and taken that risk. And number two, it was never about money. It was always about relationships. I wish I'd invested more in relationships with friends and family. Instead of going into the business and spending an extra 10 hours on the weekend getting that deal, or driving the tractor when I didn't have to for an extra 10 hours, I wish I'd gone and seen my kids' sports carnival or something like that. So I think that's very important. And it's only once people get to the end of their lives or have a significant health event that they start to reevaluate it. So, I think that's perfect. Well, thank you very much for your time. I sincerely appreciate it. I learnt a lot. And, where can we find you online, I suppose, is the next question.
Ben, we have our own website, resoluteproperty.com.au. Feel free to go there and check us out. There's some recent sales and a few things there that'll be of interest. And just, you can probably Google me and a phone number will come up. My business partner, Grant Beavers, he's also a very big part of the business, and don't hesitate to reach out.
Perfect. Well, I'll put those in the show notes if anyone's got any question or wants to have a chat.
Excellent. Thanks, Ben.
I think the summary points from Ben at the end were great, and I just want to reinforce a few more, so just bear with me. Number one, speak to your accountant, financial advisor, and solicitor well in advance. But if that isn't possible, then you must speak to them before you sign anything. Follow that advice, because I think I've seen too many people run afoul of things because they didn't speak to their right people. Number two, choose your people wisely. Jim Rohn famously once said, you're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. I believe the same can be said for your professional advisors. There are normally millions of dollars involved, and as a result, there's some really big bucks on the line if you have the wrong people advising or guiding you. Number three, treat the sale like a major project and don't just stick your head in the sand. Get in front of it, treat it like it's the most important thing in your world. Number four, make sure any of the stakeholders are all on the same page from the start. Now, and as an example, husbands and wives should sit down and discuss the process and what's involved, and no one should abdicate responsibility. You don't want to be sitting down going, okay, you make the choice. I'm happy with whatever you choose. You need to be on a united front and have a plan. It's also, if you've got children involved or someone else you trust, is making sure you all have a plan for what you're going to do, because you don't want to hit a road bump or have to make some tough decisions and everyone's on a different page, so to speak. And number five, the market's hot right now and making sales is easy, but at some stage it's not going to be. You need to be thinking like a savvy businessman or savvy businesswoman and be prepared to plan and execute with precision. Now, if you're enjoying the podcast, consider joining our private Facebook page, The Financial Blokes Wealth and Wisdom. And as always, if you can help a bloke out and share the podcast with your family and friends if you're enjoying it, that would be amazing. Thanks for joining me today, and I'll see you in 2 weeks' time. The information contained in this podcast is general in nature and for education purposes only. It's not financial advice and it's not legal advice. You should not act on the information without appropriate specific advice for your particular circumstances. I'm a former financial advisor, but I choose to no longer be licensed and cannot and will not give you specific or personal advice in this podcast.